This is Gemara Zevachim Daf Lamid Dalid Agutavach Aguzot Winter. We're going to pick it up really on the top of Lamid Dalid Aleph, but we're just going to go back a drop to begin the Raya again. Tanya Kavase to Reish Lakish, 5 lines from the bottom of Lamid Gimel Lamid Beis. We like all the learning to be an incredible schos refuah shlema for Gavriel Simcha ben Miriam Ahuva. Psiyat Dishmaya, the incredible Kayach HaTorah, as we start another year of Torah after Simchas Torah, should be the ultimate schos refuah shalema for Gavriel Simcha ben Miriam Ahuva. So we're picking it up 3 lines from the bottom, 5 lines from the bottom, excuse me. Tanya Kavase Deresh Lakish. B'chol Kodesh Loi Siga. Says the Torah about a woman who gives birth, she should not touch anything that is kodesh, anything that is holy. And this pasuk is a hazara, the warning la'achol, to one who eats kachim while they are tameh, that you're not allowed to. Loi siga, don't touch kachim if you're tameh. Says the Gemara, Taimer, you're telling me hazara la'ichel. You're telling me it's a hazara la'ichel, one who eats food when they're tameh, or maybe it's a hazara for someone who touches tameh, as the pasuk really says, "V'chol kodesh loi siga." So maybe the pasuk is referring to siga and not to achila. Says the Gemara Talmud Loimar, "V'chol kodesh loi siga v'la mikdash loi savoi." The pasuk continues and tells us that the Beis Hamikdash you should not enter. From there, makish kodesh lemikdash, from the hekish, from the smichos, from the putting the two halves of the pasuk together, we create a hekish from the kodesh, that which is holy, to the mikdash, to the Beis Hamikdash, which is what? Ma mikdash davar sheyesh bai nitilas nishama. As we turn over to Lamed Aleph and Aleph, just like the Beis Hamikdash, if you enter when you're tamei, what's the halacha? There's nitilas neshama. As the top Rashi fills in the blanks, means there's kares. Av kodesh davar sheish bai nitilas neshama. So to the first half of the pasuk, when it's referring to kodesh, it has to be something that the punishment is nitilas neshama. Now says the Gemara, what is an entity that the punishment has, nitilas neshama, has kares? Says the Gemara, even again, and if it's only talking about touching, kachim, the tils l'shama mihika. It's not. There's no kares for touching kachim when you're tamei, ella be'achila, and that is our raya. That if one eats kachim when they're tamei, the punishment will be kares, and this is the raya, a klar raya to shitas Reish Lakish that we had in the previous Daf Lam Gimel base. Ask the Gemara about Kati by the Tamei Shachal Basar Kaidash Livnei Zrika. But wait, Reish Lakish really needs the pasuk as a azhara for someone who is Tamei, who eats kachim, but before the completion of its avodah, before the Zrika. So asks the Gemara, so how could the pasuk be talking about aveira that ends and the result is krisos? Maybe the pasuk is talking about doing a lower level aveira, which is eichel basar kodesh nezrika, which doesn't have krisos. But how do you know the pasuk is not talking about that? Says the Gemara, and how do we know that he needs that pasuk? Ditmar tamei shachal basar kodesh nezrika Reish Lakish amar loika. Rav Yechon amar einay loika. Reish Lakish amar loika. Why? And this is the pasuk. Why is there malchus if you eat the kachim before the zrika? Because b'chol kodesh leisiga, and from there Reish Lakish learns out leishna lefnei zrika v'leishna la'achar zrika. The halacha is there's malchus. Rav Yechon amar einay loika k'netani Barzal taught us asya tamasai. We learn Gzeir Shava of tamasai between the pasuk Torah talking about tama with regard to eating kachim while he's tamei, to the pasuk talking about tamasai by entering into the Beis Hamikdash, and says Rav Yechanan, and there the Torah is only referring to if it's lachar zrika, and that's when there's going to be malchus. And therefore, but lefore zrika, says Rav Yochanan, there won't be malchus. But what do we see? We see that according to Rav Yochanan, the pasuk of v'chol kodesh leisiga is needed for the aveira of eating kachim lefnei zrika, that is malchus. So ask the Gemara, how could Reish Lakish have taught us Alam and Giblam and Beis that this is the pasuk for teaching us for eating kachim when you're tamei lachar zrika? Responds the Gemara, Im Kain, if you're right, limer kra b'kodesh, my bechol kodesh, shema mina tarti. Says the Gemara, you're right, and all your pieces really add up perfectly. But there's another extra word. The Torah could have said b'kodesh. Why does it say bechol kodesh? To teach us both dinim, and that really wraps up the previous daf, which is the raya to Rav Yochanan, Akasha, and the right to Rish Lakish, Akasha, and Rish Lakish holds his own. Now the Gemara goes and quotes the aforementioned Braisa that we just quoted, the Machlekes Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish. About 10 lines down, the first one line is B'kodesh Gufa. Tamei she'achal basar kodesh and Zrika. We just quoted a Machlekes Rav Lakish Amar Loike, Rav Yochanan Amar Einay Loike. So what is this machlekes? Amar Abaye, machlekes b'tomas hagof. Machlekes over here is where the person that is eating the basar kachim lefnei zrika, he is tamei. Aval b'tomas basar. But if the carbon is tamei and the person eating is tahar, divrei akol, there will be malchus divrei akol loika. Says Abaye, how do I know this? Tamar krav basar l'rabbis eitzim ulevaina. And yet, Rabinu Kra. So says Abaye, what do we see? We see that whenever we're talking about that you're consuming basar kachim, that's edible, kaidem hazrika, there's certainly going to be malchus. Rava argues, and Rava Amar Machlekes b'tomas hagof, avotomas basar divrei akol einay loika. Meaning he agrees that the Machlekes Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish is by b'tomas hagof, but he says, but if it's tomas basar, the exact opposite conclusion, there'll be no malchus. My time, akim do karina be v'tomasai alav v'nichrasa. Therefore, like karina be v'basar sheyiga b'chol tamei lo yoichal. So Rava argues, asks the Gemara, 1 second. What does Rava do with Abaye's pasuk? Responds Rava, smack in the middle of the Amid, the first one line is Hacha. Hacha b'mayaskina kion shekatshu bekli, the katshu bekli. Where the Eitzim, the Levaina, were Kaidesh by putting him into Kli Sharis. And therefore, dinase kimisha karvai kol matirov. And therefore, it's as if it's a story where the matira of that which makes it mutter were already brought. And therefore, if you eat the eitim, you eat the levaina, while you're telling you get malchus. However, we don't have a raya, like Abaye said, that it's going to be teaching us that eating basar kachim, kaidem zerika, if you're tamei, that there'll be malchus. Ditinan, where do we see this from? Kol sheyesh loy matirim, mishakarvu, matirav, kol she'ein lo matirim, shekadosh bekli. That's where it's going to have the creases. So that is a sidebar machlekes Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish and Abaye and Rava's argument as to what is the machlekes. So really, if we're keeping track, we started with a raya to Reish Lakish. In order to bolster Reish Lakish, we brought down another raya, another memra, a machlekes Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish. Once we brought down the machlekes Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish, we quote Abaye and Rava that argue what's that machlekes. Now says the Gemara, once we're on the topic of Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish, I'll tell you another memra. So it's really almost an agav of an agav. Itmar. Says the Gemara again, we're basically smack in the middle of the Amid, a little bit past smack in the middle of the Amid. First word of the line is Misha Kadash Bikli. Itmar. If someone is makri, if someone brings up the ivarim of a behema tmeya on the mizbeach, Rish Lakish amar loike, Rav Yochanan amar ino loike. A similar machlekes what we just saw. Says the Gemara. Rish Lakish amar loike, why? Tahira in tmeya loy. Says Rish Lakish, you get malchus, why? Because Zakta Taira, what's a carbon is only a Tahira, but a Tameya is not a carbon, and therefore you get Malchus. But the Torah didn't say it explicitly, but anytime you have a lav that you learned out from an essay, the essay is the positive commandment that stayed in Torah, you have to bring a Tahira. Says Rish Lakish, so the obvious implication is you can't bring a Tamera. And lava b'mechlala say, like it love, you get malchus. Rav Yochanan amar, no, ain't like it love. Why? Lava b'mechlala say, ain't like it love. So we really have a fundamental machlekes Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish in the world of malchus. Whether if you learn how to lav from an essay, does that translate into malchus? And in our discussion, it manifests itself. Someone brings up a varim of a behema tameya on the mizbeach. So Maisev Rav Yirmiyah asked Rav Yirmiyah on Rish Lakish that says there's malchus. Aisatay chelu says the Torah, you eat kosher animals. V'loi behema tameya. Lav b'machala say, and a lav that you learn from an essay is an essay, and therefore, what's the kasha? Kasha is, says Rav Yirmiyah, that the Torah, when it talks about kashrus, says Aisata chelu, which is implying a not a behema tameya. And so to not eat a behema tameya is, of course, the same lava ba machala say. And what's the halacha? The halacha is it's an asay. And are there malchus? The answer is no, as the brisa there says explicitly, a straight up kasha and Reish Lakish. Amrli Rav Yaakov the Rav Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa I'll explain to you. If we're talking about the varim of a behema tameya that's brought in a carp on the mizbeach, that's not the machlekes Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Kuliyam loy pligi, everyone agrees that there's no malchus. Why? Because that's a lava mechalase. So what's the case where Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish says there is malchus? Keep pligi bechaya, a wild animal. A kosher animal, but a chaya, not a behema. There's two types of animals, a behema and a chaya. A chaya, for example, a tzvi, a deer is a chaya. So if you bring that on the mizbeach, v'achi yitzmar. Rav Yochanan amar oiver ba'asei. Shlakish amar inoi oiver v'loi klum. Rav Yochanan amar oiver ba'asei. Why behema and chaya loi? That the Torah says was a carbon, it's only a behema, not a chaya. Just a mitzvah to bring a behema. But if you bring a chaya, you're not over a lav. A deer is kosher. But if you bring it, says Rish Lakish, you're not over v'loi klum. So Maisiv Rava asked Rava on Rish Lakish, Ilan Emar Karban Lashem. If the Torah would have said Karban Lashem behema, Hayisi Aimer would have said Chaya Bechlal behema, that a Chaya is included in a behema, kinin shenemar, as it says, Zois a behema shetaychlu shar seksavim seizim ayil tzvi v'goimer tamalaimer bakar v'tzayin. If it would have just said bakar v'tzayin, amarti l'cha would have said v'lo chaya yachalo yavi v'imhevi would be kosher. Halamaz etaymer letalmid shamar le rabbi. This is similar to a Talmud that the Rebbe says to him, Havali chitim, bring me wheat, veheveloi chitim, usairim. He adds on another item. She'ena kemaver al dvarav, is he violating the Rebbe's words? The Rebbe said chitim, and he brought chitim, but he also brought sairim. So he's not maver, he's not transgressing. Elomaisiv al dvarav. The kosher. So you would think that such a carbon in such a scenario, if you brought a chaya, it's kosher. Tamid loymar bakar v'tzayin. Bakar v'tzayin. If it would have just said bakar v'tzayin, amarti l'chav lo chaya. Halamaz et tamid l'tam sham l'rabbi. Al Tavili Ella Chitin. Now the Rebbe said, I want only Chitin. And what did he bring? Vehevilo Chitin Usairim. Shena Kamaisal Dvarav. So now you're not adding on El Kamavral Dvarav because he said, I don't want Chitim. And it ends off the Brisa. Oh, as we turn over to Lamidalim and Beis, oh, Puzzle, and a Chai would be Puzzle. Therefore, a straight up Brisa says if you bring a Chaya, it is Puzzle, certainly a Lav. Therefore, Tiyufta de Reish Lakish is a Kasha and Reish Lakish who said, you're not Oiver V'loi Klum. Tiyufta, it is indeed a Kasha. So after a segue of a segue, a Machlekes Rav Yechon and Reish Lakish, which began with whether there's Malchus, it continued with by a behema tameya, continue with by a kosher animal, but a chaya if you're over an avera or not, and we frag up and we end with a tiyufta on Reish Lakish. Continues the Gemara v'kulam shekiblu v'chulu, the top line of Lamdalim and Beis, quoting the Mishnah that if you did the Kabbalah of the dam with a machshava to eat it chutz l'zmanei chutz l'mekaymai, then what is the halacha? It depends if there's still dam nefesh. Is there still some lifeblood there that could fix the story? So Bayi Minei Reish Lakish, Rav Yechon Reish Lakish has a kasha. Pasal Mahu Sheyaseh Shirayim. Does a person who is pasal and he does Kabbalah, he catches some of the blood and he puts it on the Mizbeach, does he make the rest of the blood Shirayim? Meaning, are you allowed to continue the carbon or not? Says the top Rashi, spells this out. Kibal v'zarek ma'u sheyachzer ha'kosher v'yikabel v'yichshar ha'karbon. Are you able to save the day after apostle does the Kabbalah? Is the kasha of Reish Lakish. And Rashi continues, it tells us, spells out the study, Ashayla, third line in Rashi, Mi amrina kiv the zarek apostle shavi ledam shebesavar shirayim v'suloi mechzi lizrika. Do we say it was puzzle, so the rest of the blood that comes out is like shirayim, is the remnants, and therefore there's nothing you can do about it? No, you messed up. It's not going to mess up the rest of the blood, and therefore a kosher is allowed to fix it. So Rav Yochanan was asked the k'shayla from Reish Lakish, and Amar Lei Rav Yochanan responds, in Isa shirayim cannot be fixed. Ella in Isa shirayim el chutz zmanoi v'chutz limkaimai. That excuse me, I read this wrong. Amar Lei ein Isa shirayim. Excuse me. Ella chutz zman v'chutz limkaimai. The only way it's shirayim, meaning that you cannot be fixed, is if he had a kavana of shel chutz l'zman and chutz l'mekaymai. Why? Hayol meratzah lepigulai, since it makes the carbon piggle. But if not, if it's just a puzzle, then you would, yes, be able to fix the story afterwards. Rav Zid Masli Hachi, Rav Zid has a different lashon that by Minei Reish Lakish Rav Yechon Kais puzzle ma'u she'aseh shirayim. What if you did a Kabbalah, if you caught the dam in a kais that is puzzle? Amar Le, puzzle gufei. If the puzzle gufei ma'isvir le, if the puzzle himself threw the blood, what's the halacha? I puzzle mashi shirayim, then kais puzzle nami mashi shirayim. So you see that in this lashon, it's really one step back. The shayla was about a kais puzzle, and the response was, wait, go back. What if the person was puzzle? Do we say that it's mashi shirayim and it can't be fixed? I puzzle le mashi shirayim, then kais puzzle nami lo mashi shirayim, or not? So Rav Yirmiyah midifti masniach. That's the second lashon. Now we have a third lashon, and in this lashon it wasn't Rav Yechon and Reish Lakish, but rather it was Abaye v'Rav, Abaye v'Rab, Abaye minei Abaye me'Rab. Kais ma'u says chaveroi dachui. Now the shayla takes on a slightly different form. Does a kais puzzle, if it was received in a kais, Mashas chaveroi dachi shirayim, does it make the other cup that it's caught in shirayim oy dachui? Meaning, can the second cup be helped? Look at Rashi. Rashi spells this out. Ki goin chata shekibal dama b'shnei kaisis. Talk about a case where you accept the dam in two kaisis. So the shaila is v'nasan kol matanaisav me'echad me'em chaveroi shirayim u'v'nishvach liyisoy dechseves kol adam yishvech l'goymer. does the accepting one wrong, does it mess up the other case or not? Oishirayim. Dacha Yeshem Amalei looked into Rav Lazar Rav Shimon Rabbanan. Titana Titanya Lamalu Oimer Es Dama Yishvaich Lamato Oimer Es Kol Dama Yishvaich Minayin Lachatish Kibul Dama Barba Kaisais. So how do you know if a chatos was caught in 4 cups and also matanachas mizeh matanachas mizeh shekulan? That what do you have to do if you sprinkled from 2 different cups? That what's the halacha? The shbachim liyisay. They all have to be poured. All the dam is poured into the yisay and mizveh. Tamalei marves kol dam yishbach. Yachal nasan arba matanis mikois echad. You kol nishbachim liyisay. Tamalei marves damai ha ketzad ho nishbach liyisay vehin nishbachim nama. Plus Rav Shimon Aimer Menayin Lachatash Kibul Dama Bar Bakais is also Dalam Matanis because Echad Shekul Nishbachim Liyisay Tam Leimer Veskol Dama Yishvaich I Voksiv Ves Dama Yishvaich Ravash Yulemuti Shirayim Shabsavar Behema. So in this Lashon, the Shaila of the Gemara takes on a little bit of a different form, and it has to do with the fact if you did the Kabbalah in multiple cases, what you do with it, and it boils down to Machlekes Rav Elazar Rav Shimon and the Rabbanan. Continue with the 2 dots, Samak in the middle of the Amid, Kibbal HaKasher v'Nasan L'Apostle. Quoting the next case of the Mishnah, that if a Kasher did the Kabbalah and he gave it to someone who's Pasul, said the Mishnah, you should give it back to the one that is Kasher. Then the Mishnah said another case. If you did the Kabbalah with the right hand, then you put it in your left hand, you should go put it back in your right hand. Then the Mishnah said a third case. If you did a Kabbalah with a Kli Sharis, and then you put in a non-Kli Sharis, you should put it back. So 3 cases seemingly teaching the same din. So says the Gemara Sricha, it's all one Yisaid. The Yisaid is that if it's done right and then done wrong, you should just put it back. So why do we need all 3 cases? Says the Gemara, Di Ashvina Pasal Avamina, my Pasal Tamei, the Chazil Avoida Sibur. I would have thought, what does it mean that the person is pasul? Means he's tamei, which be'etzim at some level he has a sheikhus to avoida. Why? Because if everyone was tamei, he would be able to be part of the avoida. Aval small, your left hand is never any sheikhus law. You would think it doesn't work. V'yashminan small, I would have thought this leach shei Rabbi Yom Kippurim. Says the Gemara, the left hand, there is one avoida on Yom Kippur during the ketores of the Yom Kippur, that he has to use his left hand, because you have the shovel in the right, you have the ladle in the half left, and that's how you walk into the Kodesh HaKodashim. So you would think it has epis sheikhus. Aval Kli Chol loi, but a Kli Chol never has part of that avodah. V'yashvin Kli Chol, I would thought Mishon Dechazi LeKedushinu. Kli Chol could be made Kodesh. Aval Hanach by your left hand, someone who's Tamei, Emalai, Sricha. Therefore, we need all 3 cases in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, okay, so now you told me why I need all 3 cases. But why is the din in the Mishnah true? When you mess up, whether you give it to someone who's puzzled, whether you put it in your left hand, whether you put it in a klichol, it should be dachui. Why are you able to fix it? The sheet of the Mishnah is Chanana Mitzihu the less lay dechuyin. Doesn't hold to the yesod of dachui, and therefore even once it's messed up, you can fix it afterwards. Even blood of the chatos was in a cup, and the other seer, this is the seer lazazel, the seer chatos, kodesh Hashem, kodesh lazazel, and if one of the dams is in the kais and the other animal dies, what's the halacha? Maybe chaveroi u mizaveg la, you could bring the other carbon, and it still works. And he doesn't hold that once one is pushed off, it pushes off the other one. Rav Ashi Amar Kol Shabiyadai Lo Yavi Dachui. Says the Gemara. Rav Ashi says, I'll tell you another teretz. Even if you hold of Dachui, however, but if it's still within your power, it's biyadai, it's in your yecheles, you're able to fix it. That's not called Dachui, and therefore, if you're still standing right there, it's be fixed. Amar Rav, says Rav Shaya, Kavase Dravashi Mistavra. Man shamas like this like dechuyin. Rav Yudah Titzanan. Vayim Rav Yudah nishvachadam. If the blood spills, yamus hamishtalech. Mesa mishtalech yishvachadam. No, excuse me. Yishvachadam. Not if the blood spills. If the blood of it doesn't mean the blood spills, but in a specific case, Seir Lazazel, Seir Lashem. If the blood of Seir Lashem spilled, then yamus hamishtalech. the Azazel's left to die because now it is puzzle, and you have to bring another pair of goats. But if the one that was going Azazel died before the other carbon was finished, and Yishvach Adam, you have to pour out the blood. And another din the Rav Yehuda said, if it's biyada, you sat dachet tan Rav Yehuda Omer, kois echad hay mamale midamat harayves, v'zarkus rich agas and get aside. So what do we see? Shema mina, kol shebiyada lo avidachi, shema mina, shitas Rav Yehuda, Rav Ashi, a second teretz by us. Even though you're right, it's dachet, but it's biyada, you could fix it. We'll allow you to fix it over here. Pick it up from here, b'siyata dishmai.